Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. It is Aaron, and I have a quick announcement before we jump into our show. We have the privilege, again this year, to partner with the awesome folks over at the All Things Open event, and that's coming to Raleigh, North Carolina, October 27th to the 29th. I'll be there, and I would love to see you there as well. In order to make that happen, All Things Open are offering 5 free passes to the event for the Cloudcast community. Now, these are first come, first serve, so just follow the link in the show notes if you're interested. All Things Open is one of the highlights of the year for me. Great community, great speakers, and it's really nice to see folks from all over the world descend here in Raleigh. So go grab that free pass while you can. Now, let's move on to our interview. This week, we are talking identity verification and threat detection with Rick Song, co-founder and CEO at Persona. And that is coming up right now. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is your co-host, Aaron. And our topic for today is really interesting. It's all about fraud detection and personas and personal identities. And so we're going to dig into that. It's an area we've dug into a little bit before, but probably not to the depth that we're going to talk about today. And so for that, we have Rick Song, co-founder and CEO at Persona. Rick, how you doing, man?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So first of all, welcome to the show, and give everyone a little bit of background and a quick introduction, please.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Rick. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Persona. Usually I think I always like to introduce myself from by way of my past. So prior to all of this, I was an engineer at Square for Block now for just about 5-ish years. And it was a lot of my experiences there that both taught me kind of how to start a startup, but also really kind of the challenges and importance of identity. Never did I imagine how pertinent it would be in this world of AI. But at that time, I mean, many of the details that we were thinking about back then continue to apply here. So, Persona now is about 5 years old, almost 6. We've been working in the space of identity verification and personal information infrastructure for all this time, and we work with all sorts of customers. I mean, one of the most unique things about Persona is our ability to kind of adapt and mold to any type of business out there. So anywhere from a TravelX to a Coursera, from Square to OpenAI, we power all of their identity infrastructure to make sure that they're verifying identities in a secure and robust way and hopefully preventing fraud, and also managing the personal information in a compliant, but more importantly, privacy forward way.
Sure. That's fantastic. And so I definitely want to dig into Persona and some of the details there. But before we do, you did mention you kind of cut your teeth at Square, or now Block. What lessons did you really learn there that you brought forward, and what experiences really impacted you in creating Persona?
I would say, well, the most obvious one is I learned how to be an engineer there. That was really my first job out of college. So I suppose that might be the most important experience. But outside that, I think, there are a lot of values at Square. The one that always resonated tremendously with me was the value of starting small. And I think that's very different from, these days, especially within the startup ecosystem, the Valley, sometimes I think starting small oftentimes implies almost fake it till you make it, like building something, that's smoke and mirrors, especially this era of AI, right? Create something smoke and mirrors, and then later on you can flesh out all the details. But start small, especially at Square, I think meant something very different, which is start with a small product that was done right. In the world of payments, you really can't do such crazy things, especially in such a regulated space. And rather than trying to, build the vision and then, smoke and mirror it up, instead, lay the foundation for the smallest feature that a customer wants. Build that really, really well. So in the early days of Square, that would be the Square Reader. Make sure that works tremendously well, and then expand from there. And I think for identity, it's very similar. We could try something in which, again, smoke and mirrors things, but rather build something small, make it work really, really well, and then grow from there. And I think that was one of the most important lessons, especially if you're trying to build something that is sensitive, that has a lot of regulations, compliance, details.
Sure. And it's funny too, because, there's always like this shorthand, especially with startups. It's like, what kind of startup are you? And it's like, we're the Uber of whatever, or a lot of times you'll hear we're the Square of whatever. And you get to literally say like, you're the Square of, identity management kind of thing. Right.
Yeah.
So in this instance, the analogy plays out directly. Let's talk a little bit about, personal identities and how we kind of got here. Right. Like, so of course, I feel like just about every day you see something about personal fraud, or like, oh, you'll get a letter from, I don't know, somebody, your bank, your credit card, somebody, oh, your identity got out, right? Like, I feel like identity theft and personal information leaking to the world just happens more and more. And so how does that relate to persona in the fact that like you want to build a secure platform around all of this, right? Like, how do you take that idea and then create an entire framework and product around all of that?
So, especially on the topic of data breaches, I think, this is one of the most common questions that we get. And this is one of the other learnings I really got from the world of payments, which is the challenge that we face, and especially the sheer volume of data breaches that we see today. I don't believe the core cause is an inability to secure it. I think there's two fundamental ones. The first of which is far too many targets. And the second is lack of incentives to really secure it, especially when you have so many targets. The analogy I always give is that within the world, if you're talking strictly about what are the most valuable targets in the world to hack, there's two that come out immediately. Number one, hacking a cloud infrastructure. If you can hack an AWS, a GCP, every other business in the world is built on this at this point. That is the most valuable thing if you could breach. Number two is if you can hack a payment network, or even one of these like payment businesses, an Adyen, a Stripe, a Square, etc. The number of card information, the immediacy of value that you gain from being able to get access to such a platform is tremendous. But we don't really see that too much. And I think one of the major reasons for this is we're seeing a similar evolution right now within the world of identity. But if you look way back, credit card leaks were rampant. Like really, if look 10, 15 years back, there were a tremendous number of data breaches there. I even oftentimes tell folks, one of the jokes of I tell folks that my dad used to tell me that the dumbest way, to lose all your money is to put in your credit card information online. But today he doesn't think twice about this. He's on Amazon, he's buying things, all day, he's retail therapying away. I think we're in a similar ecosystem for personal information. The challenges that this space faces, and the reason why there's so many data breaches, is there's far too many targets. At this point, it isn't, at the end of the day, if you have 1,000 companies, you just need to find the weakest link. And as long as there's a tremendous treasure trove of personal information out there, there's an opportunity. So I always like to tell folks the security challenge is not intractable. It's just that there are too many targets. And the more companies who want to kind of offload this, secure it within a platform that's dedicated towards protecting personal information, the more secure the overall online ecosystem will be. The second question often then becomes, how do you secure it? And I think the most important thing here is defense in depth. Building a lot of layers. And one layer that I think is oftentimes criminally underthought about is people. Like, there's no better way. If you look at half these data breaches, oftentimes they're through phishing attacks, they're through some mechanism over escalation of privileges. More so than ever, I think it's important that you consider not only the infrastructural protections, which I think a lot of modern tech companies do a great job around, but also the people protections and making sure who within an organization has access to all the personal information. How much can they have it? How do you have audit logging? Can you track anomalies? Can you detect, and can you add many layers of authentication to get access to this privileged information within the system? I think is really, really important. So for us, it's a huge area of focus for us. And our long-term belief is that the best way to limit the number of data breaches, secure personal information, is to have fewer targets, and for the targets that do exist to be incredibly, incredibly robust and have many layers of defense.
That makes sense. It makes perfect sense. Let me ask you, I almost feel like this has become a table stakes question on the podcast, but how has AI impacted this industry? And what I mean by that specifically is, I think that with the power of Gen AI tools, the idea of multiple targets just goes up dramatically, and the fact that you've got a greater velocity, right? Like you can go after more targets and create more things faster than you could before. Is that a correct assessment? And how do you see, like, does AI become a threat to your industry, or can it also be helpful as well? What's your thoughts around that?
So I suppose this actually is probably the common answer that you hear, which is it's both. It's 100% both. So I always like to talk about the threats first. I think it's the more interesting of the two. Again, working in the fraud industry, you oftentimes think about things that way. The threats, I think, are immense. And in particular, the ability these days for someone to be able to fabricate, create synthetic identities, high quality video fakes, facial takeover, and lowering the barrier to that. So one thing I always like to tell folks is that generative AI is not net new. Like, there were many ways, even like 5 years ago, there were incredibly high fidelity ways to take over your face, swap your face out for like Tom Cruise's or things like that, right? Those had already gone viral. The challenge generative AI really presents is that it's lowered the barrier for that. Like the sheer, like now with just a couple of prompts with the company's models, and especially with the sheer velocity that space is improving, is easier than ever to be able to produce incredibly, incredibly high quality fakes. In many ways, I think it challenges a lot of the notions of how can we use just pure video and image-based verification, which for much of the online fraud prevention industry has been kind of the state of the art, honestly, for the last 3 to 5 years. It's challenging that paradigm shift. And I think the biggest one is that now there's no longer this single silver bullet for how do we stop fraud anymore. For a long time, videos, images, like a photo of your government ID, a video of yourself, performing some degree of actions were relatively robust. That's not to say fraudsters can bypass it. Many fraudsters have been able to bypass it for a long time, but it was relatively difficult. Today, it's become easier than ever. The solution, I think, more so than ever is going to be there's not going to be a single way, but rather multimodal. I think it's actually going to take a lot of cues from what's been happening in the world of cybersecurity, which is after MFA and then after, after SMS, 2FA, the rise of SMS hijacking, things like that, prompted the industry to build out new technologies and, more importantly, add in a lot of passive detection to be able to say this is a high risk one, and combining passive approaches in which you say, hey, like this looks a little bit more suspicious. I can't say for high confidence you're a bot, but let me ask you to do something else. I think we're going to see a very similar rise from the world of identity. And there's a lot of companies already doing this. I've heard terminology of this from progressive risk profiling, segmentation, risk segmentation, step-up verification, but many, many in the industry are already adopting such techniques. And I think more so than ever, it's going to be a hit on image-based verification. It's not going to be the end in the same way that most 2FA today still performed using SMS. However, I do think the complexity of this space is going to rise dramatically because of this new vector of fraud.
Sure.
The good news, I suppose, for the industry, I can't say it's good, but I think it's a tailwind for this space, is that for both consumers and enterprises, it's going to be more important than ever to do identity verification to detect AI. And the reason why I say this is that what really AI does for consumers is that it makes it such that content moderation, especially automated content moderation, kind of is dead. There's just no way at this point to be able to detect that some content's written by AI. I've seen many approaches out there. I don't think anyone has found a lead. OpenAI published a paper just a couple years back, and now they've kind of given up on such approaches. I don't think there's going to be a world in which you can use AI to detect AI anymore, at least purely based off the content alone.
Yeah.
And I think what the rise of this is going to be is more verification on all sorts of platforms. We're already seeing a rise of this. LinkedIn is pushing for verified profiles. Twitter or X is pushing for verified profiles. And I think Meta, Reddit, all these platforms, we have a strong belief that's going to be more important than ever. And for enterprise, I think it's going to be the rise of phishing. There's going to be a huge wave of more and more phishing attacks. Most, as mentioned earlier, the number one route for insecurity for a lot of these platforms oftentimes is through people. And phishing, I think, is going to be the primary way. And what we're seeing right now at the enterprise level is many folks are making employees do two-step verification, using biometrics, using some form of identity verification to attest that's actually the same physical person to get access to these services. So I think that, it's going to be, what we believe is going to happen is there's going to be more identity than ever because there's just not a way anymore for AI to detect AI.
Yeah. Yeah. And, what you said, it reminds me of, without giving out too many details about it. So my daughter was involved in kind of a identity theft kind of thing recently. And it was really surprising to me because in order to prove she was her, she had to submit a picture of herself. She had to submit a video of herself, like saying like she didn't do the thing. And there was all these other steps. Like it wasn't just like your typical, oh, we're going to send like the credit card companies. Oh, we'll send you a thing in the mail and you sign and say, oh, I promise I didn't do that. And they write it off. Like it was very, very in depth. The steps you had to go through. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay. So that's, I guess, where we're going in the future now is like picture evidence and video evidence and these other things to prove identity. So it's
I apologize in advance. That may have been us.
No worries at all. No, it was super fascinating. Now, so let me ask you this though. So let's kind of dig into Persona a little bit. Is it like almost like a third-party API architectural or like Stripe of like, if I'm a business and I want to do identity management or, theft prevention, it is basically calling a bunch of third-party APIs? Or like if I'm an architect, walk me through what that looks like.
So as you were saying earlier, an Uber for X or X for Y, I think that we are very much so similar to a Stripe for identity, Stripe for X in this sort of case. Our two main ways is via API or via SDK. If you embed the SDK, it will also perform all the information collection, make sure the data is transferred securely, and then it's collected into the platform. One thing that I oftentimes like to really emphasize is that we're a data processor, not a data controller. So the data doesn't even belong to us. We have minimal access to it. It really belongs to our customers. Our general belief is that long-term, building a single company who is verifying everybody on behalf of everybody as a data controller. I oftentimes joke, I'm not quite ready for such a future yet. It does seem rather dystopian, So I think that the status quo in which, much like payments, every single company integrates and builds out their own payment stack. However, oftentimes leveraging folks like Stripe, we believe a very similar future for identity, which is we offer the infrastructure for these businesses in which they can architect their systems. Our system will help secure the information collected and verify it, and then also manage it as well. So if they want to redact it, it's truly deleted. It's not like replicated anywhere. It's completely wiped. You can set retention policies. You can set compliance policies, consent policies to make sure all of the data for every single different region, for every single different individual is properly managed and redacted at the right schedule, especially once it's no longer of use. But beyond that, integration is super easy. You can do it via API. So, just a couple of lines of code. We oftentimes joke it takes less than an afternoon, especially, if you have a stack that can make external API calls, minus all the complex networking, or even easier than that, SDK. SDK embeddable is just maybe 10 lines of code, drop it into any sort of website out there or within your mobile application, and you can get integrated immediately.
Fantastic. What kind of platforms are you seeing for the most part? Is it truly like a lot of people are mobile first these days, like it was in the early days of Stripe of like plugging in the readers, or what does when somebody does do APIs or SDKs, what platforms are they typically targeting to get started?
So usually at this point, we see deployment across all three platforms in simultaneity. So I'd like to believe it's because our platform's easy enough to integrate with, but usually if someone's rolling us out, they'll get us set up on their Android app, their iOS app, and on web all at once. And most commonly, the adoption path is via SDK. More so than ever, the secure management, transfer, collection of personal information is really complex. So to do that safely, the benefit of the SDK is that as an organization, if you're using it, no data touches your core infrastructure unless you want to. So it's not like you're collecting, government IDs and like first transferring this into your database before transferring it to us. This could be really complex. It's much more similar to Stripe in this way, in which if you use our SDKs, it bypasses your infrastructure entirely. You can get access only to the information you want, and then everything else kind of handled on your behalf. And, I use Stripe because actually collecting credit card information, now you have to be PCI compliant. You have to deal with all of these complexities. If you're using Persona, you don't have to deal with all the consent language. You don't have to deal with all of the regionalization of data. All of that can kind of be handled automatically for you.
Sure. And actually, that was going to be my next question is, so based off of that, especially with the regionalization of things, how much of your time is spent building out the systems, and how much of your time is just complying to all the different, places in the world that you can have different rules and regulations? It almost seems like super easy for me as a customer wanting to use this, but it almost seems super hard for you to stay on top of all of that.
So that's a real pain point for us right now. I have oftentimes joked that the real superpower of Persona is not the verification technology, but rather the flexible infrastructure that allows us to dynamically adjust to new regulations. At this point, there's new regulations in every region you can imagine. And the strength of the platform is less so like us having to kind of build all this out, but rather it doesn't require deploy on our side at all, and just configurations. It allows, we can dynamically modify everything within the infrastructure, from retention of the data, where the data is stored, how the consent language displayed, like based off the IP of the end user. All of that can be done without any sort of deploy at all. And that really is where the magic comes about. And I think the strength of that is why Persona can work with so diverse industries, from many of the largest marketplaces to many of the largest social media companies. We're working with all of these folks primarily because of the flexibility that allows us to adapt to the regulations, not only on the regional level, but also on the industry level. Industry level regulations are also really quite the complexity.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
So in a weird way, to answer the very, very original question, I would say it's a combination of both. Much of our work these days is actually improving the infrastructure to make it even more flexible. So one of the core kind of benefits of Persona is that I can't tell you anymore where the world's going to move. The world seems more uncertain than ever on so many dimensions, frankly. However, I think that flexibility and adaptivity are the best ways to respond to uncertainty. And I think Persona is a platform built with the belief that things are going to be uncertain.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I think that's a great place to end as well. So Rick, if anyone was interested in this or interested in following you and figuring out everything that's going on, where can they reach out?
So we're at withpersona.com. You can also always just email me. It's just rick@withpersona.com. But we're very, very excited to work with customers of all sizes. We work with some of the largest enterprises all the way to some of the smallest startups. So please don't hesitate to reach out. It's been really exciting for us to be able to be on the forefront of kind of what's developing on this space.
Fantastic. Well, Rick, thank you very much for your time. And on behalf of Brian and myself, for everyone out there, thank you for listening this week. And of course, if you have feedback, show@thecloudcast.net is the easiest way to get hold of us. And of course, wherever you get your podcast, if you can leave a review, we'd love your feedback as well. So with that, I'm going to close this out for this week, and we will talk to everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.